I am Vincent Sabatier. I am Director for Space Initiatives here. And among those initiatives, there is one which is very dear to our heart, is the promotion of human space exploration globally. And globally means both internationally, but as well across sectors and across fields. And today, the topic, I think, is very timely, not only because this afternoon there is a hearing on the Senate side, I believe, about the future human space transportation system. So I think it's important that we make room for space tourism, which is another side of the human space transportation. But I think it's important as well because, as we all know, there has never been so little money in the space agencies. They have more and more missions to accomplish. And compared to other parameters, such as the federal budget, the GDP, the defense space budget, for example, their budget is declining. At the same side, NASA, for example, has been given a very, very daunting task to go back to the moon, which needs actually a lot of resources. And at the same time, we have a very, very peculiar situation where there is a lot of money in the private sector. And some of you know that. And so space tourism is a way to get money outside of the traditional space agencies and hopefully to contribute very positively to global space exploration. Initially, commercial space was about telecommunication satellites. And so now we have the emergence of a new market, which is called space tourism. Patty will tell us more about that. It's a market currently undertaken, I would say, by billionaires, to name a few, but you know them all. Elon Musk with SpaceX, Bezos, Blue Origin, John Carmack, Armadillo Aerospace, Sir Bronson, Virgin Galactic, or even Robert Bigelow, with Bigelow Aerospace and his space station. So there are a lot of names there and a lot of money available for this new market segment. And it's very important because this is a first step. It's a suborbital loop that they are going to undertake at the beginning. So they will live in a spaceport and they will come back to the same spaceport and they will perform a suborbital flight. But there is a lot of growth beyond that. They can first do point-to-point, for example, add a transatlantic trip, for example, eventually. And they will maybe be able somehow to help NASA, for example, to join to service the space station with the COTS program. So it's a little nucleus, but which has a lot of potential. And it has a potential to revolutionize as well the way the space agencies around the world think about human rating. So, of course, this activity must be regulated because it has to do with, rockets. Some of them could call them flying bombs or whatever. And at the same time, you have civilian passengers. So there is a need to balance the safety and the business, and that's a very, very tricky job that Patty and her team did over the last 2 years. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Patty Smith, who is the Associate Administrator for Commercial Space. She's been in this position several years. I've always known you in this position, and I was lucky to be able to work with her in a past incarnation. So commercial space has evolved significantly over the last decade. The RLVs, the commercial spaceports, the infrastructure like sea launch, which allow to launch from sea and not from continental US. All those evolutions demanded a lot of work. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Patty, who is going to update us on the state of the regulation for space tourism.
Thank you, Vincent, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to talk to you about my favorite subject, private human spaceflight, space tourism, where the industry is going, and our role in it. The NCAA basketball finals are this weekend. The Major League Baseball season starts this weekend. And he wants me to talk about federal regulations? Poor Vincent. But then I thought, well, no, actually wise and perceptive Vincent, because spaceflight, which has been almost exclusively a spectator sport since it began, is about to open the gates to public participation. What a remarkable development that is. People who are not pilots, not scientists, not military officers, hi, Bill Reed? Not astronauts, not specialists, will be able to take a ride to space. It will all be made possible by private entrepreneurs investing their own resources in their own dreams and inviting the public to buy a ticket and join them. How exciting is that? The government's principal role in this is developing a regulatory regime focused on the safety of the uninvolved public that at the same time regulates in a way that does not stifle the emerging private human spaceflight industry. And that's very, very important because unlike our counterparts in the FAA, we have promotion as a part of our mission. Our mission is to license and regulate and protect the uninvolved public and to promote and enable the commercial space launch industry. So on this subject of federal regulation of space tourism, or what's becoming known as new space, I think the best place to start is at the start. And right from the start are these words, and I quote, "Space transportation is inherently risky. The notion of risk is so intrinsic to human spaceflight and so important that the congressional authors of the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act of 2004 put those words right up front so you can read them before you read almost anything else. When Congress adopted this landmark legislation, it didn't pull any punches in pointing out to potential space travelers that if they wanted to do this, fine. but they needed to do it with their eyes and their ears wide open. In the same paragraph about risk, Congress spoke to both potential passengers and vehicle developers alike when it pointed out, and I quote, "The future of the commercial spaceflight industry will depend on its ability to improve its safety performance." You can't frame the issues any better than that. Private human spaceflight is risky, but it has a future, a definite future. That future hinges on everyone in or connected with the industry working all the time to make it as safe as possible, mindful that it will never be risk-free. That's probably why we kind of like it. We are risk takers, and a lot of people are, and this kind of raises that risk-taking spirit. Some have said that the country has become risk-averse. Well, when you look at the list of people who've signed up for the first flights on vehicles that are still in the development phase, maybe not quite so risk-averse. Let me quote one more time from the legislation, a quote that will help explain why I'm here. "A critical area of responsibility for the Department of Transportation," the legislation said, "is to regulate the operations and the safety of the emerging commercial human spaceflight industry. The FAA operates under the Department of Transportation, and the Office of Commercial Space Transportation that I lead is part of the FAA." So there you have the basic package. Congress passed and the President signed the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act of 2004, essentially directing the FAA to regulate commercial human spaceflight to help ensure that it's operated safely, the appropriate role of the government, safety. To that end, under the terms of the law, Congress mandated regulations to establish experimental permits to be like experimental airworthiness certificates, similar to them on the aviation side. And on the aviation side, EACs have existed for a long, long time. A project currently moving to publication. The point is that the more you test, the more you learn, and the greater the likelihood that your vehicle becomes better and safer. I'll come back to that in a minute. Congress also mandated rules governing private human spaceflight requirements for crew and spaceflight participants. The final rule for crew and spaceflight participants was published on December 15, 2006, and became effective in mid-February of this year. So that rule is in place. At the core of these regulations for spaceflight participants, let's just call them passengers, is the idea of informed consent. In a nutshell, that boils down to making sure any passenger intending to make a suborbital flight is fully informed of the risk involved so that the passenger can make his or her own choice on the best and most extensive information available. That's what the law says, that the spaceflight participant or passenger must be given the safety record of the vehicle and vehicles like it, as much data as is available as a result of the testing and development of the vehicle. Most of us are familiar with the informed consent approach in a medical context. There, the patient is required to demonstrate their cognizance. Do they in fact know what's about to happen to them in that context? In both writing and verbally, so that you have a sense that yes, they do understand that in the operation that they're about to have, the following things could occur. So that is an approach, verbal and written, that we've adopted in the informed consent approach for this new emerging industry. The operator is obliged to tell the passenger that the United States government has not certified the vehicle as safe for carrying flight crew or spaceflight passengers. We don't certify vehicles. Maybe down the road, one day after we've had many, many flights, the industry has evolved and emerged, we will look more at the design of the vehicle. But for now, in order not to stifle the industry, overregulate it before it gets started, we look at the operations of the vehicle. We make a determination with respect to how this vehicle will operate. Realistically, it is not possible to give assurances to anyone, preparing to board a rocket for a suborbital flight that there's nothing to worry about? Of course there is. We're talking about rockets here, very powerful vehicles powered by volatile fuels. Risk attends any space flight, and it's the operator's obligation to make sure the potential passenger is aware of it. Even so, this is not to suggest in any way that there is or ever will be any compromise on safety. These rules have been developed within an overall environment that puts the safety of the uninvolved public as the primary factor in everything the Office of Commercial Space Transportation does. So that means that we will, as we already do, work closely with vehicle developers and launch operators to license the safe operation of vehicles and launch site facilities, with our inspectors on hand to make certain that the terms of any license are scrupulously followed. We have a real benefit of coming to the Commercial Space Transportation Office and FAA, and that is we license the operations of sea launch. And if you happen to be a safety inspector, we say you get to take a 3-week cruise. Now, that's not quite how they see it. It's 1 week out, 1 week at sea, if all goes well, and 1 week back. But we like to think of it in that way. It helps to market this very important venture. That approach is clearly evident in the features of the regulation dealing with the crew of a spaceflight vehicle. In fact, let me take just a minute or two to give you a few details. To begin with, the rule applies to any applicant for a license or permit proposing to conduct a launch or reentry with a human on board the vehicle, just as it also applies to a licensed or permitted operator conducting a launch or reentry with a human on board a vehicle. Next, the rule applies to flight crew or spaceflight participants on board a launch or reentry vehicle, and it applies to a remote operator of a launch or reentry vehicle with a human on board. Each crew member must possess and carry an FAA second-class airman medical certificate. They must complete training on how to carry out his or her role on board or on the ground, remotely operated, so that the vehicle will not harm the public. And they must train for his or her role in nominal and non-nominal conditions. We want to see how they function when the vehicle is operating nominally as well as when it's not. Each member of a flight crew must demonstrate an ability to withstand the stresses of flight, which may include high acceleration or deacceleration, microgravity, and vibration to the vehicle that will not harm the public. So there's a lot of testing that we're looking for the vehicle developers to do under a number of different circumstances. A pilot or remote operator must have an FAA pilot certificate with an instrument rating. They have to have aeronautical experience and skills necessary to pilot and control the vehicle that will operate in the National Airspace System. And they must receive vehicle and mission-specific training for each phase of flight. The rule also establishes requirements governing environmental control and life support systems, smoke detection, and fire suppression. The rule requires an operator to account for human factors whenever the crew must perform safety-critical roles. The rule also requires an operator to implement a verification program sufficient to verify the integrated performance of a vehicle's hardware and any software in an operational flight environment before carrying a spaceflight passenger. In other words, we're not only making sure the systems work, but that they work in an integrated fashion. And all these requirements rest on the foundation fact that the FAA regards the flight crew as part of the flight safety system. The pilot in aviation is a part of the flight safety system of the aircraft. No different here when we're talking about spacecraft and spaceflight. The rule requires an operator to train each member of the crew and define standards for successful completion of the training. The operator must update crew training by incorporating lessons learned from training and operational missions, document completed training for each crew member, and establish a recurrent training schedule. Consistent with the provisions of the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act of 2004, The rule now in effect requires crew and spaceflight passengers to enter into a reciprocal waiver of claims with the U.S. government. Cannot sue the U.S. government. The legislation also expressly excludes spaceflight passengers from eligibility for indemnification against third-party claims. Congress felt that this was very much in keeping with the risk approach that this legislation embraces. If the passenger wants to go, the passenger may secure his or her own insurance. They accept the risk that they're taking. What I've discussed this morning doesn't cover everything in the rule, but I've pretty much given you all the key points. I'm happy to tell you that although not everyone subject to this rule sees everything exactly the same, and no one ever does, the reception has been solidly positive, and we're very pleased about that. I'm not surprised, given the industry-wide emphasis on safe operations to the company. That's what they emphasize. And the reason that they do is because they know what it means not to plan properly, not to emphasize safety, and that what the broader implications are for the industry when and if something happens. So how you start out often allows for a greater reception on the part of the public, especially the uninvolved public. And I say temporarily uninvolved public because I firmly believe as this industry advances, more and more people are going to want to be a part of it. This industry simply wants to get it right. So people are spending time. They're not drawing lines in the sand and fine points on deadlines. They want to be able to test and develop the vehicles as much as possible so that they have the assurance that the vehicle will be able to operate safely. Earlier I mentioned testing to help assure safe operations, and that I'd get back to the subject in a minute. Well, this is the minute. At the FAA, we are at the end of the rulemaking process for experimental permits for reusable suborbital vehicles. This rule has been reviewed and cleared and will be published shortly. That's the second part of what Congress told us to do with respect to regulations. When the experimental permit rule is published, we will have both pieces in place. The aim of the rule is to expedite research and development on the vehicles intended to carry passengers on suborbital flights. To help facilitate testing of those vehicles, the allowable processing time for making a determination on a permit is reduced by law to 120 days that we have to issue a permit determination versus 180 days for a license. An applicant for a permit must provide 4 things. 1, a program description. 2, a flight test plan. 3, operational safety documentation, including a hazard analysis. And 4, a plan for responding to a mishap. So we want them to think in the moment, but also to think about how they would prepare in the event that a mishap occurred, how they would respond, rather, to that mishap. Once issued, an experimental permit will cover multiple vehicle launches of a particular design and allow unlimited launches. The FAA will identify the type of design changes that may be made to a launch vehicle without invalidating the permit. The commenters wanted to know, do we have to keep coming in for a permit determination, a license determination? So we wanted to be certain that we were putting in place an approach that allowed for unlimited launches under a permit. No person may operate a reusable suborbital rocket under a permit for carrying any property or human being for compensation or hire. So while you're testing and developing the vehicle, you cannot carry passengers for comp or hire. The 1-year permit is renewable following an FAA review. The rules also prescribe the criteria for the physical area in which a launch vehicle with an experimental permit can operate. Among other things, the area has to be large enough to contain any planned trajectory and cannot contain or be adjacent to a densely populated area. We want an environment that is conducive to testing. That's a partial sketch of the proposed experimental permit rule. Clearly, the aim is testing and development to promote safety. Just as clearly, that kind of thinking is a feature of the emerging ROV industry. So let me explain. In February of this year, we held our 10th FAA Commercial Space Transportation Conference. Perhaps some of you were there. It was, I must say, outstanding. For many reasons, all of them involving exceptional people devoted to private human spaceflight. Safety influenced every discussion, regardless to the panel topic. Just to give you an example, let me tell you a little bit about the last panel of the conference. It was amazing. Sometimes when you schedule a last panel, the audience is withered down. People are on their way to the airport. Not at this panel. The room was full, the ballroom. The panel was called, "When is a launch vehicle ready to carry passengers?" Probably a question that all of us have asked. The panelists were certainly familiar names in the industry. George Whitesides, who with his wife is set to be among the first to ride on a suborbital trip. Jeff Grayson of X-Corps, John Harrington of Rocket Plane Kistler, and Alex Tye of Virgin Galactic. The collective message of the vehicle operators was, no surprise, safety. There won't be any manufactured deadlines, they said, or preset number of flights that when completed will determine whether a vehicle is safe. It will fly when it is safe as the builders can make it. Alex Tye said there was no point in pressuring engineers. And you know how engineers can be. Some of you are in here, engineers. You need to test until you learn what you need to know and have proved it. Jeff Grayson spoke about stretching the envelope, expanding the envelope, which is another way of saying you discover, incrementally through testing, the strong points and the points in your design that need improvement. You go one step at a time until you have a vehicle that is safe enough to ensure, safe enough to make money, which is another way of saying a vehicle that convinces, he said, the passenger that the risk is worth taking. It's important to note that these and many of the panelists are operating under a regulatory regime that always ranks safety at the top of the list. They are comfortable in that kind of regime because really they are the people who put safety at the top. That's a very important point. And so is this. Private human spaceflight did not sneak up on policymakers. By the time Spaceship One captured the X Prize, the work had already begun on the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act. Actually, we had been talking about it for a while. The United States is leading the way in private human spaceflight for a combination of excellent reasons, beginning with private entrepreneurial developers with the skill and imagination to make this an industry. Added to that, the government has been and remains an ally and supporter, a fact made clear in the U.S. space transportation policy announced in 2004, something Brett Alexander knows a lot about. The President's vision for space exploration and support and encouragement from NASA's Mike Griffin. The U.S. space transportation policy said, and I quote, "The United States government must capitalize on the entrepreneurial spirit of the U.S. private sector, which offers opportunities to open new commercial markets, including public space travel," end of quote. That's what the policy says. And I submit to you that as citizens, we have an obligation and a responsibility to ensure that this happens. That same policy included a directive to the Department of Transportation under which the FAA operates, and I quote again, quote, "to encourage, facilitate, and promote U.S. commercial space transportation activities, including commercial human spaceflight." So what you have here is a combination of the private sector and the government working toward the same goal, and joined by communities around the country who see private space activity as a job creator and revenue producer. Still, I know whenever the topic of regulation comes up, it's almost inevitable that a palpable skepticism comes with it. So let's look at regulation from a slightly different perspective, the perspective of Europe. Last summer, the Vega Group in England released a study on space tourism. The very first issue listed among those affecting space tourism in Europe was lack of a regulatory framework. The study devoted a good deal of attention to the American legislation I've discussed, concluding that the, quote, United States through the FAA has created a favorable regulatory environment for space tourism. Whilst emphasizing safety, regulations do not stifle the growing industry. No such regulatory environment has been seriously considered in Europe, end of quote. That's nice to hear. Makes you think we're doing something right, and we are. And we have in human spaceflight. What we have in human spaceflight is 50 years of federal precedent, but very little hands-on experience by private entrepreneurial developers. The regulatory framework brings to this new effort a reference point, a measure of stability, as very capable people apply modern science and physics to a very old dream. I can tell you it's very gratifying to be part of this, to be a companion to private enterprise, as it makes the most of fresh thinking about space and new business plans and new vehicles. One of the great things about working in this field is the realization that the future that imagination has taken us to so often before, is closer now in a very real way than it has ever been. Private citizens will fly in space on private vehicles. It's about time, don't you think? Maybe you will be one of them. I certainly plan to be, and it won't be long now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patty. We have time for some questions, so who wants to? Yes.
Something I've always wondered, if you're regulating the spaceports for safety, downstream, and the rest of it, if you're dealing with the stage of the experimental permits, why not just tell the spaceports anything that they're flying without people, without cargo, that's up to you, and when they're ready, then they come petition the FAA for a license to do this. Why have the extra?
If I'm understanding your question correctly, it sounds as if you're saying, why not delegate some of the responsibility that we might have as a federal agency for spaceports and vehicles that fly from spaceports to the spaceports to handle?
Well, if you're going to give them, if you're going to regulate them and say, the spaceports, we give you the authority to handle flights, then obviously if they start doing things that are more risky or whatever, they're going to start showing track that violates their license with the FAA. And so therefore, if they're going to meet their safety rules that are essentially set down by the FAA to the spaceport, why not just say, as long as you're able to maintain these rules, anything that flies out of your spaceport is acceptable. If the companies who are doing tests are having problems, well, then that'll affect the safety record of the spaceport, in which case then the FAA steps in. But to regulate the spaceport on downrange safety and then regulate the vehicles seems to be an extra, saying we're going to look at all pieces of the puzzle rather than.
Yeah. I guess, Scott, it's because we do see it as two parts of the puzzle. Our authority says license and regulate the operations of launch operators and the operations of launch sites, launch and reentry sites. So while we license the operations of launch sites, we are not delegating our responsibility with regard to the vehicles that fly from those sites. They have to have a license to be able to fly, or a permit in this case. When we go out and inspect a spaceport, a launch site, we're looking for the same kinds of things that we require of a launch operator, that they're operating in compliance with the terms and conditions of that license. So there's a lot that goes on in terms of customers coming to the spaceport. The analogy would be airport authorities, another transportation mode. Airlines fly from airports every day. There are slots that are allocated to those airlines to fly from. But the aircraft that fly from the airlines, from the airports, is certified by the FAA, the design of the vehicles to operate safely. So by statute, it's a two-part process.
Now, the test side of aviation, the FAA doesn't regulate tests from the individual companies, do they? Oh, yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Joe Pelton, George Washington University. We've just completed a 250-page study, actually, that's online at www.spacesafety.org on space planes and space tourism. And my study comes from that, or my question comes from that. We looked at many things, the commercial, the safety aspects, and looked at potential showstoppers. And the one that came out with left field and looking at this was the environmental impact. As you know, the Concorde was grounded, and people thought, well, this was a good thing because of all these flights to the stratosphere was impacting the ozone layer. And the question really is, who in the U.S. government is addressing this issue if we do have very sustained large number of flights up into the stratosphere in terms of the ozone impact and the environmental aspect? Really, this is not what the FAA is asked to do, but is it the EPA, or is anyone actually addressing that issue?
Actually, it is us, and that's a great question. And we are making a lot of progress in terms of identifying and implementing streamlined approaches to our licensing requirements in the environmental area. But I'm going to ask Herb if he'd like to speak to that point, because that's his responsibility.
Thank you. Interesting to hear what your study has to say. We do the environmental impact studies for all the launch sites and the launch vehicles. Of course, it's done in cooperation with the applicant, who supplies a lot of the information to us. We right now have developed some programmatic environmental impact statements so that we have generally classified vehicles in certain ways in order to be able to make it easier for the vehicle operator to get the environmental accomplished. And we've also expanded the environmentals for the launch sites to make sure that a variety of vehicles are able to launch from there. However, there are a couple of things. First of all, we're not exactly sure of what the chemicals will be used in the engines that in the propulsion systems of new vehicles, and we're not about to dictate that to the new developers. They would rebel against that. And the other thing is that fortunately the number of launches right now are small, and environmental studies are only required to cover a period of 5 years. So the number of launches right now are so small that we have had a very small impact. And then finally, most people have looked at this as an economic driver in their communities, and they like the idea of having launches and launch sites in the area because it brings new business and new activities into the area.
If I could just have a follow-on to say that on November 12th and 13th, Auburn University, George Washington University, Herb, you've been a part of these discussions, and Ohio University, a large number of other people are sponsoring the group that will go into some of these issues in more depth. So you can go to a variety of sites, including the spacesafety.org, and get updates, but we'd like everybody who's interested to participate on November 12th.
I think Joe brings up a very interesting point with the Concorde. As best I know, the FAA regulation didn't regulate the level of the sonic boom or the impact on the ground. It levied a prohibition on supersonic flight over the continental United States.
That's my understanding.
Well, I think physics involved in suborbital spaceflight require supersonic flight. I think you're going to have to make some kind of exception for that, even though you are going straight up, more or less.
And we have. But during Spaceship One, we did get that. We had the discussion with our Office of Environment and Energy at the FAA and did ask for an exemption for that specifically.
Okay, well, you're breaking the sound barrier on the way up and also on the way down,
Mhm.
decelerate. But the question, I think,
I think you might also have to look at the times.
for the future,
when that
though,
occurs.
is it the sonic boom, or is it the environment on the ground and the level of the overpressure? Is that something that the FAA is going to look at?
We're working with our environmental office to look at sound, at noise. Certainly
We actually
noise,
measured it.
and certainly we do measurements when we're at the launch sites. That's why we're looking at a programmatic environmental impact statement for the experimental permit, and look at all the sites, just so that we'd be able to let developers work on their vehicles without having too much of a burden of the environmental activity. When they go and become more commercial, we'll have to do another study. But we know that there are limitations right now. We'll have to deal with them as the
And also,
industry
as the
grows.
vehicles get larger, as the industry takes off, so to speak.
We like your way of thinking,
larger,
though.
you know, the sonic boom problem winds up getting.
Right.
We
One-
look forward to those problems.
Yes. One of the things that we have worked very hard and long to do is establish a corporate approach to how we handle these matters. So, for example, we've had a relationship with air traffic that started with, very infrequent launches, what happens when the manifest grows, what happens when routine flight. So we have a plan to integrate routine space flight into the National Airspace System going out to 2025.
Ram, you have a question?
Paddy, first of all, I think you're certainly to be congratulated on the regulations you've achieved. My understanding of regulations is that, that they relate exclusively to suborbital. What about orbital?
Orbital, yeah. I really want to ask this question.
We have not begun working on those yet, but we certainly have that in our vision, because we know and believe that many of the developers that are developing suborbital vehicles have plans to go to orbit eventually. This is good testing ground, a good opportunity to baseline some of the things that we might require beyond. And we have, of course, a tremendous history of 182 flights on the ELV side and 0 accidents, a record that we take very seriously and work very hard to maintain. So we will be working orbital regulations for vehicles that are reusable in nature. We have RLV regulations in place, have had for some time now. So each one of these iterations begins to expand the envelope, and more over time we start to look like transportation, which we will get to.
Yes, Patty. This is Alice Wong from State Department. Thank you very much for that very exciting overview of what you guys have, how long you guys have come. You mentioned Vision 2025. Clearly, I think you convinced us that the future is here now. I'm just curious with regard to, I see what you're going through is what aviation gone through for the last probably 80 years, and we can all see how far aviation has arrived and as part of our daily lives. And just looking out, I don't know how much daily operation you were thinking about by the next 10 years, next 15, or year 2025. So I'm just curious, by then, if you have a lot of daily operations, are you going to establish like operational, like air traffic control center? Are you going to have a space control center? And how would the FAA and NASA divide up the operation? And also, you mentioned airport, airport authority, and so far, so on. So should industry takes off, you're going to have a special spaceport established strategically at some remote area so all the industry will line up and schedule for time for launch. Can you just share with us a little bit about your future vision and what would that entail?
Thank you for your question. Certainly something I think about a lot, all the time. The day that I see out into the future is one in which there are real similarities to aviation. Launch sites around the world, availabilities coming up at various launch sites that can adapt to multiple types of rockets. And wherever the launch site is available, the rocket goes from that launch site. That's when you start to really see the global effect of what we are talking about. Passengers in one part of the world who want to come to San Francisco. And there is an available opening at a launch site in whatever area gets them closest to San Francisco, or maybe San Francisco. I also see, as this industry evolves and develops, the opportunity to get non-traditional, as has already occurred, non-traditional industries involved in space, either as cottage business supporters as they grew up around airports, the same thing with spaceports. We are seeing more and more interest, just a little bit of data to share with you, from states that we've never heard from in the past, who are interested in establishing their own spaceport. And many of these are inland in nature. Our history is around coastal sites. I'm happy today not to have the problem of a launch site proposed for Manhattan. That's something that, in time, not now, thankfully, but certainly as people, I was looking for that data, certainly as people look out to the future and what they want that future to be, more and more, we have an interesting issue before us right now about, as we look at passengers traveling on vehicles, a passenger who wants to have a weightless experience, who happens to be handicapped in a wheelchair. The launch operator that is planning to, the flight operator, I should say, that's planning to, Stephen Hawking, I'm talking about, has tried to mitigate some of the concern on the part of the aircraft owner by saying, well, look, yes, he is bound to a wheelchair, but his doctors are going to fly with him. He'll have 2 caretakers on board. We'll modify the parabolas that the aircraft usually flies. If at any point he needs to come back, we have a plan to bring him back. Well, the federal aviation regulations, and this would be operated under that regime and not ours, say that the passenger has to be physically fit. Well, obviously, in traditional terms, he's not physically fit. If the doctor attests to the fact that his patient can fly, what does that mean? How would that be considered? How would the FAA look at that? So we're helping the rest, our partners in the FAA, to facilitate some very tough questions. I guess my vision, the long, the short of the vision, with that operational scenario that I just gave you, is that we are going to enable this industry. We think it's important for it to exist. We think it will take the form of the next mode of transportation. And it's very, very important that we engage around it to make that happen. There are a lot of people who have dreamed about it, and happy to say that Congress recognized that people do have the right to fulfill their dreams. What they want is a safe environment within which they can take that leap in fulfillment of their dream. And that's our role, which is an appropriate role for the government to have, in my opinion. You were waiting, and I want to come to you because he's been trying.
So, okay, I'm Brian Wingfield with Forbes.com. You mentioned Europe and kind of the lack of regulation there, but I'm just wondering if there are any international partnerships that the United States is engaging with other countries to set up some type of global regulatory framework. And I guess the example I would use is, let's say a company in China, with the support of the Chinese government, wants to establish some type of space tourism industry. How do you ensure from a safety perspective that they're on the same page as the FAA's regulations, but also from an investor standpoint? Because presumably if it's cheaper to make equipment and to build it, and there are fewer regulations in another country, industry would go there instead of remaining in the U.S.
Our statute says that if a U.S. citizen launches from the U.S. or another part of the world, they have to come to our office for a license to operate their launch vehicle. When Australia was looking at providing a launch site for Kistler, Australia came and spent roughly 6 weeks to 8 weeks in our office, learning about our regulations. When they finally introduce their legislation, they are almost a mirror image of our regulations. We think that's a good thing. We like that. One of the differences between aviation and the FAA and us is aviation requires technical assistance to countries like China. China that plans to be second only to the U.S. in aviation. So our aviation partners go to China and provide technical assistance, show them how we do things, explain in very specific detail our standard setting approach. We don't provide technical assistance because a part of our mission is to enable the U.S. industry to compete internationally with other launching states. So it's a bit of a difference in our approach. When I was in China, in Shanghai last, not last December, but December the year prior, I talked about the things that we're doing in private human spaceflight and how important it was in this burgeoning industry for space tourism, et cetera. I got questions to the effect, can you talk to me about the operational characteristics of the vehicle? No, I cannot. That's not my role to tell you how our vehicles operate. So my aviation counterparts on the trip were talking to the Chinese about things like that, attempting to create for interoperability and cooperation, in many cases a mirror image of what we do in flight standards or aircraft cert. That's not our role at the current moment as this industry is getting off the ground. We want it to be able to compete with the Ariane vehicle in a very, very viable way.
Could I add some information? On May 14th through 16th in Chicago, there's going to be a meeting of the International Association for the Advancement of Space Safety, and there'll be a whole series of panels talking about the International Civil Aviation Organization role, the role of the International Association for Advancement of Space Safety. There's also a European agency for space, European Aviation's Space Agency, that is certainly working very closely with ESA in terms of their development. So there is a lot of activity at the international level.
Let me just, as data points, just give you this data. On the experimental permit side, we've issued to date 3 experimental permits, 2 to Armadillo and 1 to Blue Origin. Launches under a permit, there have been 7. Armadillo has done 5, and Blue Origin has done 2. And then in talking about the landscape earlier, where states, I said, more and more states are interested. We have existing launch sites in California. We have 2. Oklahoma, we've licensed as a launch site. Florida, Virginia, and Alaska. Launch sites are in various stages of development in the following states: New Mexico, Wyoming, Hawaii, Washington State, Montana, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Alabama, Utah, and Texas. So just think about that.
I see a basic problem. I don't want to be the skunk in the meeting. But, this is an infant industry, and I don't really know of any other industry in the history of mankind where the regulations were issued before we really knew what we were talking about. And give me the other impression I have, there must be at least 1,000 regulators and 1,000 academics for every prospective suborbital customer for the next 5 years. I mean, here we have conferences, there's meetings, international, but we don't really have one customer. Should one consider that for the development period, say the next 10 years, people who are rich enough to spend $500,000 on a flight can sign a general release that, if they die for whatever reason other than if it's on purpose, then the murder statutes apply, and be risk happy. Because I can see myself in 1890 with the FAA worrying about, the Wright brothers, and let me tell you, you would not have given a fly permit for that piece of, construction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a basic problem. So the idea would like to advance, why not have a general release that customers who are wealthy enough and risk-happy enough, it's up to them. There's nothing in the Constitution which gives you authority to prohibit somebody who is conscious and informed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. In response to that comment, I would say that the general release that you suggest, in to me, a very frontier-like spirit, still does not take care of the uninvolved public. That's what our statute requires us to do, protect the uninvolved public on the ground. And that is very, very clear as this industry emerges. And I think, one of the things that I think it behooves all of us, whether we are as enthusiastic as I am about the industry or a little, concerned, maybe cynical, is the way this industry is emerging. If you go back and look at aviation, it's not really that dissimilar. Those early flights involved people with deep pockets. Movie stars and politicians were jumping on airplanes and going out and barnstorming. It took that testing period, that kind of sanction in a way for those who had the means to provide it. But as it evolved, look at where we are. Aviation is the safest in the U.S., safest system anywhere in the world. So one of the good things, I think, about the way this industry is evolving is we are putting in place a framework. Government is embracing this progress. Congress at the highest levels and the president who signed the legislation is saying, in the spirit of exploration and risk and, dreams, we want to cultivate that and allow that of our citizens. But we do not want to do that at the expense of those who are uninvolved. We must protect their safety to the extent that we can as the industry goes forward.
What kind of scenarios or simulations have you done concerning an eventual accident or catastrophe? What kind of plans do you see for that, and do you foresee possibly prohibiting, that flyer from doing certain things, or do you just see a market, scenario as far as the public then eschewing them like a JetBlue or Delta when they lock that passenger in, or something of that nature?
We're looking at all kinds of approaches or plans in that area. I think we have to. The Personal Spaceflight Federation, that Brett Alexander is the president of, is helping us with that. John Gedmark as well. We must plan for, we must be thinking about what messages, a common message that we all speak. The only model that we have around an accident is the shuttle in space. And we know what happens when there's a shuttle accident. Things shut down for long periods of time. An entrepreneurial-based private enterprise industry cannot afford that kind of shutdown for that length of time. So how we help legislators to understand what the ramifications of that kind of a shutdown would mean for private industry is very, very important. Now, an accident happens and passengers are killed on that vehicle. That's a serious thing that we all know is serious. We have to be very forthright in how we communicate what happened. Totally honest in what happened. Also embrace the fact that the passenger, in taking the flight, was cognizant of the risk he or she was taking. We are encouraging the operators of vehicles to do all kinds of simulations. Before Spaceship One flew, they simulated lots of environments. Brian Benny and Mike Melville, before they ever flew those vehicles. Again, remember what I said, nominal and non-nominal conditions. We want to understand and have a sense of that in all respects.
We have time for one more.
Yes.
Jim Vetta, Aerospace Corporation. Patty, you mentioned that the spaceflight participant regs went into effect in February, and that we have experimental regs that are due out soon. given the fact that promotion is one of the duties of your office, my question is, when are you going on the talk show circuit? And that's only slightly facetious because the Today Show, Oprah, those audiences know generally what the FAA does, but they've never heard of your office, even though it's been around for 2 decades. And now that you have things lined up with regulations, you've got some cool video clips you can show. Maybe it's time to get a little more exposure at that level. I think there would be some response to that, and I think you'd be a great spokesman for it. Doesn't everybody think she'd be a great spokesman for that? Yeah. So when do you start?
Thank you, Jim Vetta. Thank you, Vincent. This is
Well, thank you very much, Patty. Again, I think it was a great meeting, and if we are able, we'll put your speech online, if you agree with that. And I would like to mention a couple of things before we break. The first one is CSIS, and our initiative, Human Space Exploration Initiative, is going to be more involved in promoting new financial mechanisms for space exploration. Space tourism is leading the way on that. So there is a conference organized in New York, I believe, by Boeing in April, and I encourage all of you to participate if you have time. The second thing I would like to mention is that April 9th we'll have here the administrator of NOAA, Conrad Lautenbacher, and he will speak about the GEOS and the multilateral approach to a global issue, which is observing System Earth, and that could be a model for global exploration as well. And finally, we have a report online about spiral development for space exploration, and you can see it online, and if you want a paper copy, just send us an email. And to conclude, I would like to congratulate again and thank again Patty Smith for coming today at CSIS. Thank you.